Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon here for the Aether Hub, and welcome back to another video in the history of the banned and restricted list in Magic the Gathering. So far, we've covered the first two banned and restricted announcements that came in January 25th and March 23rd of 1994. When both of those announcements were made, the only sets out were the original cards from Alpha and Beta and Arabian Nights, so the first two banned and restricted lists focused exclusively on those cards. By May of 1994, Antiquities, an artifact-heavy set, had been out for a while, and there were new cards that were causing enough problems in competitive Magic that Wizards decided to restrict them. In this video, we're actually going to talk about two banned and restricted announcements. The one in May of 1994 and the one in June of 1994. Yep, that's right, Wizards had banned and restricted announcements about a month apart. Sounds sort of familiar, right? But anyway, between the two announcements, 5 cards were restricted, and all but one of them was from Antiquities, and all the cards in this video are colorless. They all saw play in a ton of decks due to there being no colored mana in their cost, making their restrictions even more important, like Smuggler's Copter from more recent history. Anyway, let's talk about the May announcement first. Here are the cards that were restricted in May of 1994. Candelabra of Tahno, Felons Cane, Ivory Tower, and Library of Alexandria. Many of these restrictions seem a little bit strange to people who play the game today because some of the cards don't really seem all that powerful. So let's talk about why it is Wizards thought these cards were too powerful to allow more than one copy of each in a deck. Let's start with Candelabra of Tahno. A one-mana artifact that can untap X lands might not seem like much, but the problem was that there were some cards that could really abuse this, basically making Candelabra of Tahno into a new source of fast mana, like the Power 9 to some extent. The Tron lands, for example, were printed in Antiquities for the first time, but so was Mishra's Workshop, and this was the biggest offender because Candelabra plus Mishra's Workshop could result in playing 5 drops as early as turn 2. It also enabled similarly silly things with cards like Mana Flare. So in the end, Candelabra was restricted for the same reason the Power 9 were. It made getting absurd amounts of mana in the early game far too easy. It was eventually unrestricted in 1997, and since then it has seen some play in Legacy and Vintage decks like High Tide and 12 Post, which excel at making lands produce more than the usual 1 mana, but it has never been considered a candidate to be restricted since it came off the list in 1997, indicating that the game has changed a lot since when it needed to be restricted. Felons Cane is another 1-mana artifact that seems pretty innocuous to us today. In fact, effects like these are hardly considered exciting these days. The Cane exiles itself and you get to shuffle your graveyard back into your library. What's the big deal? Well, remember in the last video when we talked about cards like Regrowth, Demonic Tutor, and Copy Artifact that weren't really restricted because of their own individual power? Instead, the problem with those cards was that they undermined the restricted list, because they allowed you to play your restricted cards more than once. Felons Cane did something similar, allowing you to shuffle powerful cards on the restricted list back into your library and giving you another chance to cast them. Since this was colorless, any deck could play it, and Wizards didn't want people to be casting cards like Time Walk or Channel more than once a game. This one seems like it was a good call by Wizards because even after it was restricted, people played this card as a singleton copy for the reasons I already mentioned. You get a chance to cast stupid powerful cards again. However, Wizards unrestricted the Cane about 2 years later, and since then it really hasn't done a whole lot, so it's another card whose power level has really decreased as time has gone on. Next, we have our third consecutive seemingly innocuous 1-mana artifact, Ivory Tower. For 1 mana, you get an artifact that allows you to gain life for each card in your hand above 4. By today's standards, that is at best a sideboard card, so why restrict it? Well, with the restrictions and bannings Wizards had made over its first 2 announcements, they had succeeded in slowing the game down. The game shifted towards control decks after that initial wave of bannings, as aggro decks could no longer ramp into huge creatures as quickly as they once could, or could no longer play enough creatures at once to pressure their opponent. But control players still had access to powerful control cards, cards like Counterspell and Wrath of God, and Ivory Tower played right into their hands. Control decks usually have a bunch of cards in their hand, and Ivory Tower essentially reads as gain 3 life at your upkeep. And that made it quite powerful, marginalizing aggressive decks to the point that Wizards thought it was warping the format, and I think Wizards made the right decision here. Control decks were still really good, and still ran 1 copy of the Ivory Tower. This led to a top 8 at Worlds in 1995, and 7 top 8s at Pro Tour New York in 1996, and 3 at Worlds in 1996. And this is all while the card was restricted, so if it hadn't been restricted, it probably would have been even worse and made the format even more unbalanced. Ivory Tower was eventually unrestricted, but not until 1999, and by that point, power creep had made it not much of an issue, and it hasn't done anything at the competitive level since 1996. The final card, restricted in May of 1994, was Library of Alexandria, the one newcomer to this list that wasn't from Antiquities. Instead, this was a card from Arabian Nights that had managed to slip through the first 2 restriction announcements. Of all the cards on this list, this is the one that instantly makes sense to most Magic players today. A land that can produce colorless mana and draw you a card for free? Sure. You had to have 7 cards in your hand, but remember what I said about Ivory Tower and Control decks? Now they had 2 incentives to keep 7 cards in their hand all the time. Essentially being able to gain 3 life and draw a card for free every turn is disgusting, and the grand total mana investment for that was just 1 mana. Imagine that today. It's insane. Oh, and by the way, you could also abuse this with Candelabra of Tahno, another card that got restricted on the list, so there's some synergy between the cards getting restricted here. They're trying to sort of make the control decks a little less powerful. Unlike the other cards on this list, who were eventually unrestricted, Library of Alexandria remains restricted in Vintage to this day, where it basically appears as a singleton in every deck, and is banned in all other formats, so power creep hasn't done anything to this land, which is one of the most powerful lands the game has ever seen. So those are all the restrictions in May of 1994, but after this announcement, Wizards realized they missed another stupid powerful land, much as they had overlooked Library of Alexandria in its first 2 announcements, and as a result, Wizards made another announcement, only a few weeks later in June of 1994, and restricted Mishra's Workshop. Wizards probably wanted to see if restricting Candelabra of Tahno weakened the workshop at all, and I mean, I guess it did technically. You're not going to produce quite as much mana, but it was still completely absurd. You could run 4 copies of this land and it tapped for 3 mana. Remember what Modern was like during Eldrazi Winter? Yeah, that's the kind of shenanigans this enabled. Yes, it's only mana that's useful for one type of card, sort of like Eldrazi, but when you're producing this much mana, you're going to jam as many artifacts as you can into your deck, and you have a lot of good choices now thanks to Antiquities. So yeah, Wizards realized they needed to restrict Mishra's Workshop, and it is another card, like the artifacts of the Power 9, that enabled too fast of mana, and that's why it got restricted. It remains restricted in Vintage to this day, just like Library of Alexandria, and it isn't legal in any other formats, and thank God for that. So that does it for this foray back into the history of Magic's banned and restricted list. Next time, I'll be looking at the last 2 announcements of 1994, which come after the release of the new Legends expansion and after the first Worlds tournament, which was in 1994. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Thanks for watching.